Lovely to be here in St. Peter's Church. Lovely event, looking forward to this greatly. As part of Right by the Sea in Kilmalkey. And I'll just introduce the two authors we're going to be hearing from today. Suad Aldarra, on the far left here, is a Syrian-Irish writer and data scientist based in Dublin. She was selected as a Common Currency Writer-in-Residence for the Kurt International Festival of Literature and English-Irish Pen in 2021 and has been awarded a bursary in English literature from the Irish Arts Council. Her debut memoir, I Don't Want to Talk About Home, published by Doubleday Ireland in July 2022, was shortlisted for the An Post Irish Book Awards. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Helen Macdonald on my left is a writer, poet, naturalist and an affiliated research scholar at the University of Cambridge Department of History and Philosophy of Science. Their books include Falcon, Shailer's Fish, Vesper Flight and most recently the science fiction novel Prophet, co-written with Sin Blaché, a subject of another panel later this afternoon. They are also the author of the memoir H is for Hawk, which is the subject of today's panel. It has won many prizes, including the Costa Book of the Year and the Senator Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction. They live in Suffolk with their two parrots. Welcome, Helen. To begin something like this, I started thinking of beginnings and starting with the blank page, where we go as writers, the blank page, the blank slate, the origins of our stories and our books. That's what I started with when I was thinking of this panel. And I have a question for both of you just to kick things off, which I hope doesn't set you into a big blank mind, but it's why write a memoir? Not why write this memoir, which we'll tease out later in a separate discussion, but why write a memoir? Why make your lives public? You're going to talk about your most intimate lives, and then they're going to be revealed and disseminated. Why?
Okay, it is the question, isn't it? It's, how can you write a memoir without being incredibly self-absorbed? In my case, I had to write it, and that kind of statement I always find infuriating when I read it on the internet. I had to write, but so basically, if you haven't read the book, it's a story of how after my father's sudden death, I decided to deal with my grief by training a goswalk, something I don't recommend anyone does to deal with grief. It's a terrible idea. And I basically identified with this bird, this powerful, murderous killer, to such an extent that I really lost sight of what it was to be human. And I went out with this bird and watched it hunt every day and, came back. And it was only towards the end of this period of my life that I realized what I'd done. I'd fallen into this sort of weird sense that I wanted to just lose myself in grief and the wild. And when I came back from that place, I already knew that there was a book there because the story that what had happened to me seemed to me not just my story. It was a very old story. It felt like a trip to the underworld and back. And the shape of it was so familiar to me from so many other kinds of stories that I thought, one day I'm going to write this down and put it into words. But it took me, we'll talk a bit more about this maybe, it took me 7 years to have enough distance from that person that I was to be able to write it. And by then, the person that I was at that time had become a character I could write about that wasn't entirely me. So that distance was really important, I think, to get to the point. Because I tried, and I just couldn't quite write it until I had that distance.
Absolutely. And Suad, why write a memoir?
For me as well, it was also, I had to write it, but it was also therapeutic. I never thought I would be writing a memoir. I used to write as a hobby, fiction writing, short stories, when I was younger. But my academic background is in tech, so that kept me busy for a long time, and writing was just a side thing that I would do. But then during the pandemic, I was unemployed, I was a new mother, and I had a lot of time on my hand, and I was just going crazy with that. All the stories and life events that I've been through since leaving home. So for those who didn't read the book, I left Syria in 2012 and then moved to Egypt, lived in the US for a while, then Ireland, and I went through one thing after the other but never processed any of those. I just kept busy with work. And when I had time to process all of that, I realized that I can't keep going if I don't write down those stories. they were kind of holding me back. Every time someone would ask me, how are you doing? I would just freeze because I wasn't doing well, but I would just say, oh, I'm fine, but I wasn't fine, obviously. So I just had to let those stories get out in the world, and writing the memoir was very liberating as well. Now it's all out there. I don't have anything to hide. I don't have anything to carry with me. All those feelings of guilt and shame and trauma, basically, it's just all out in the open, and it really liberated me.
You give such thorough answers that I feel I've very little to do. You've answered all my questions. So,
but for me to ask you, what?
Well, actually, I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to quote Zora Neale Hurston at this point, because both of you, what you said kind of resonated with me. Colin McCann, in his book Letters to a Young Writer, has this beautiful quote: "There is no agony like bearing an untold story inside you. There's no agony like bearing an untold story inside you."
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really interesting. One of the things that I found fascinating about writing this memoir about a really intensely miserable time in my life, with flashes of great beauty, was how much the process of writing that memoir was a little bit like grief. And for this particular reason, when you're writing a memoir, there are an infinite number of ways to tell the story about what happened to you. But you have to choose. You have to choose the sentences that take you through what happened. And every word you write is amongst the ashes of all the ways that you didn't write the story. So you're surrounded by sort of heaps of other words you could have used that you. So in a sense, there is a great relief to telling the story that's inside you, but also there's some grief attached to the fact that once you've told the story the way that you've told the story, you've also killed all the other ways to tell the story. So it's a relief in one way, but also it does sort of weirdly shut down a period of your life and make it manageable. But also, it's quite a complicated thing emotionally to write a memoir in that regard for me. I do feel that there are other ways I could have written it and didn't. I don't know whether that chimes with you at all.
No, I didn't find that. Like I knew how I wanted to structure it.
That's very cool.
I'm glad I didn't have to choose, because I wouldn't have ended up writing. I would have been lost trying to choose a way to write it. But no, it came naturally, just to the way it was.
Yeah.
It is now structured.
And I love your book. Your voice is so assured. And one of the things I love, and yours also. I'm sorry, I'm taking over here. I've drunk a lot of coffee. But I think one of the things that happened when I was writing the book was initially I tried to be much more Californian about it. I thought people won't be interested in me, just the bird. So I didn't really talk about my emotions, and I kept running against a brick wall. I couldn't write it. And then one day I realized I had to be really, really honest about just what a mess I was and what I was really feeling, which was scary. And as soon as I did that, the book began to flow. Yeah. And I think both your books, there's such honesty in what you write that, I feel that with both your books, that you made that choice to be open and vulnerable, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, well, I had a question which I kind of decided to expand on. The question was, how do you know what to include and what to leave out, which you kind of touched upon, but I have to expand that to, do we ever reveal too much of ourselves when telling our stories? How do you know what not to reveal? Suad, what do you think? Do we reveal too much in this process?
Well, originally I revealed even more. Initially I wrote 120,000 words, yeah. And my editor was not yeah. So we had to cut down like 30,000 words. But because I wasn't sure what exactly should I include and what not to include. So some parts where I just went through it briefly, the editor said like, no, you have to expand this. This is important. And some parts were not important, so that went through that phase of what is important, what is not. But regarding what I thought I revealed about myself, I think it was important for the story, everything that I included there. And back to the honesty part, I think that's a really important part of the memoir. So before I wrote mine, every other memoir that I read and connected to and felt a lot of connection there, it was honest. I like that about the memoirs, and I wanted that to be in my memoir. And it's hard just to keep anything away. Once you open that door of honesty, you just want to be everything's out in the open, it's part of being liberated from all that guilt or that heavy burden that you're carrying with. So I was fine with everything that I shared. I tried to keep the other people in my life, their private life, just share the parts that are related to the narrative that I was telling, but try to protect their privacy as much as possible.
You know, one thing actually that ties the books together could be, and there's so many things that ties a book, but grief, one of the stages of grief, because you brought that up, is anger. And there's anger for you, Suad, in so much of the loss and the relationship with your father, which becomes alienated from an early age. There's anger. And another quote which really, really affected my writing, I was blocked writing about my family life when I wrote my memoir in 2017, and I came to a chapter which was going to be about my early life, particularly my relationship to my father. And I just found I was just too full of anger to write about him. And I went to the John Hewitt Summer School in Armagh, and Michael Harding was there giving a hand just like this. And I was in the audience, I said, you know, put my hand up before publishing a book, I asked him a question, you know, what's your advice to someone writing a memoir? He said, writing memoir is not an act of revenge, it is an act of forgiveness. Writing memoir is not an act of revenge, it's an act of forgiveness. It's Michael Harding. That helped me hugely.
Yeah.
And I don't know about the stages of grief, you mentioned that in your book, and Suad, so much loss and pain that you've been through in your story. Did that quote resonate?
Oof. I don't think... I mean, it's kind of funny, there's the rage that I felt in grief in my book was just channeled through a hawk, so the hawk had been ragey for me. So I didn't have that particular problem. And the rage that I felt was the rage of loss rather than of things that had happened before that I hadn't grappled with and needed to write evenly. Forgiveness. I don't know, I think the person that I forgave most when I was writing the book was me.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds really incredibly self-absorbed and not myself, but I was such an idiot when I wrote that book. When I was writing the book, I kept writing what I was like, 7 years before, and just honestly, I would sit there and go, what were you thinking? You know, you fool. So a lot of it was forgiving me for being an idiot. But I don't think anyone else in the book... my father's death was, we were dear friends, there was no deep issues there that I had to recover. The simple fact of his loss was the great wound, nothing else. So I think it's a very simple book in that regard. It's not, it wasn't complicated by lots of familial difficulties from before. It was a simple loss.
Yeah, for me, I think the main character or the main issue was my relationship with my father. So I was angry at the time, but I read a similar tip to that quote that don't write out of anger or write something that you'll regret later or to hurt someone or revenge in this book. And it wasn't kind of to expose my father, it was as much as to deal with my emotions and the aftermath of this relationship. So I had to forgive him before writing this book. And even my mother, we had a complicated relationship, but I always made sure to tell her side of the story or to try to see it from her side. Why did she do this or why did she say what she said? So I try to make sure that I don't write about anyone from anger, but to forgive them before, because I didn't want to regret it or read it later and think why did I say that, or not be able to face them at some point.
Absolutely. And a question which perhaps is perhaps an easy question to answer, because that question is a more challenging one, and I think as well this whole question of writing from a place of forgiveness, I identify with what you're saying, because I felt liberated having finished my book, and I didn't realise that would be the effect, but I felt I'd forgiven myself greatly having completed it as well. I didn't know that it was going to happen in the process. But what do you think is the most important quality or skill to have as a memoirist, to write a memoir? What skill or quality do you need to write a memoir? I have an answer that I've come up with, but...
well, I mean, this is quite funny because I have a terrible memory. But something happened after my father died, and I think grief quite often does this. It either makes you not remember anything after a loss, or it makes memory crystalline. So even after 7 years, I remember those dark days with extreme clarity. So memory, I think, is a fascinating thing to work with when it comes to memoir, particularly in the kinds of things that one remembers, and trying to kind of think about why particular memories are so heavy or bright or meaningful, and trying to critically unpick what it was about those memories that made them like that. So I think both a good memory, which I don't have, but also a sense that one can interrogate one's memories and try and understand why certain things hit the way they did, I think is really important for a memoirist. And also just the sheer bloody-mindedness of finishing it.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is always hard with a memoir, I think. It's finishing the story because you're still living and going on.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer, but I'm curious to hear your answer.
You actually mentioned already, I think it's time, readiness. Readiness, to be ready. I don't think I could have written my memoir. Like I wrote, it's now 7 years since I wrote it, or started to write it, since 5 years since published, so 5 years since completing the final proofreading, whatever. I couldn't have written that 10 years ago, or 15, or 8, you know. It took that to that point in my life to get it right. So readiness is the quality. You know?
Readiness is an interesting quality because it's a little bit like grace, isn't it? It falls on you. It's not something you can make happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't know when you're ready to write a memoir.
I was going to say that because if you keep waiting for that perfect moment when you're ready, you might not reach that moment. So how did you know that you were ready?
I struggled to write my story through plays and screenplays and stories, also different. None of them really worked and gelled. And then this came together. This the moment. Yeah, I think it's time. And I recognise in retrospect. I think.
Yes.
I was ready. Yeah. We're moving to some readings now. I'd love to hear. I think it's important. I love to hear authors read their own books because you never forget the author's voice then when you go back to reread or read for the first time. So your book is about displacement, about losses, about new beginnings. You described your book earlier in your own words very beautifully. Can you now please read an extract for us? Thank you.
It's so good, people. If you haven't read it.
Thanks. So I'll read just 2 pages from the prologue, so I won't keep you. We all come from somewhere. However, when someone asks where I come from, I pause for longer than I should before I answer. And every time I say I'm from Syria, I feel like I'm standing at a funeral while Syria lies in an open casket, and mourners tell me how sorry they are for my loss. When I'm asked what I miss most about home, my mind bustles with 1,000 memories from the vibrant streets of Damascus. I picture what I left behind, my sweet grandmother, my fluffy black and white cat, my pile of books. But more than all of this, the thing I miss most is myself. I was a different person then. My thoughts, my words, my outfits, and my friends were all different. Everything about me now has changed, whether for better or for worse is not yet clear. But the earlier version of me is still trapped inside. Some might call this integration. I call it an identity crisis. I may have stopped trying to explain the love I hold for Syria, but I have never let go of it. I carry my troubled homeland within me. I hide it like a crime. After 9 years of forced separation and living in other countries, I'm still not sure if I should move on, stop counting the years, and settle for a new home. Sometimes I try to define home in my mind in order to try to recreate it. I always fail and end up even more disappointed than I was before. What, after all, is home? It is the smell of a traditional home-cooked meal that greets you as you walk through the front door after a long day. A warm hug from a grandmother who always treats you like a special guest. Hysterical laughter with an old friend at a favorite coffee shop where they know your usual order. A loud family gathering you secretly wish to escape to avoid the endless praying questions. Your native language on the street signs and on the radio. Familiar faces and the roads you know like the back of your hand. It is all the little things that cannot be written down or described to those who haven't been there. It is the hole inside your soul that cannot be filled by any other place. A few years ago, I discovered a term for what I feel when I think of home, a Portuguese word, saudade. Defined in the dictionary of untranslatables, saudade is deep nostalgia, the longing for something that is no longer there. This feeling, saudade, sometimes hits me out of the blue. I might notice an Arabic word, or a colleague tells me about their trip to Syria back in the days. A song that I used to play back home pops up on shuffle, or an old photo from my archive appears on my computer screen. It hits sudden and hard, like a car crash. As if I've just woken up from a coma. I can't recognize the world around me. What am I doing here? Why is everyone speaking English rather than Arabic? Everyone becomes a stranger. I become a stranger. Thank you.
What resonates for me in that extract, so it is the thing I miss most is myself. So would you say the book is ultimately a story of achieving that acceptance or restoration of self? Is that the shape?
It is like a journey towards that. Like exploration still was happening even after the book, but part of it, yes, definitely was looking for myself through the years and through the changes that I've been through, whether it's like leaving home or like even the religious questions that I had, or the political questions, or career-wise and relationship-wise, all of that. Yeah, part of it was looking for myself in those pages. It definitely helped looking for that, but I don't think the journey is over. I think everyone still look for themselves over the years.
Acceptance as well is an important word. Helen, for yourself, it's one of the 5 stages of grief, I think, from Kubler-Ross, acceptance. Yours is a book about grief and finding one's way back to a connection with humanity through the training of a hawk. Would you like to please read an extract?
Yeah, absolutely. So I bought a goshawk on the internet. This sounds worse than it actually was. It was a very well-respected goshawk breeder who lives in the north. And I drove up from Cambridge to to Stranraer in Scotland to pick up this hawk. It was like a drug deal. It was terrible. I was pacing around on this quayside with £800 in my back pocket, chain smoking and drinking Red Bull. You know, it was really dubious. And this guy came towards me with these boxes, and he had 2 hawks, and one each, and someone else was coming to pick up another goshawk. And this is just the first moment that I saw my hawk, Mabel, who really did change my life. And it's very full on. So he's put the box on the gravel, and we need to check the ring numbers on the bird's leg. They've got a little ring on. There's a lot of paperwork and legal stuff associated with this. So another hinge untied. Concentration, infinite caution, daylight irrigating the box. Scratching talons, another thump and another thump. The air turned syrupy, slow, flecked with dust, the last few seconds before a battle. And with the last bow pulled free, he reached inside, and amidst a whirring, chaotic clatter of wings and feet and talons and a high-pitched twittering, and it's all happening at once, the man pulls an enormous, enormous hawk out of the box. And in a strange coincidence of world indeed, a great flood of sunlight drenches us, and everything is brilliance and fury. The hawk's wings barred and beating, the sharp fingers of her dark-tipped primaries cutting the air, her feathers raised like the scattered feathers of a fretful porpentine. I stole that from Hamlet. 2 enormous eyes. My heart jumps sideways. She is a conjuring trick. A reptile, a fallen angel, a griffin from the pages of an illuminated bestiary, something bright and distant like gold falling through water. a broken marionette of wings, legs, and light-splashed feathers. She's wearing jesses, and the man holds them. And for one awful long moment, she's hanging head downward, wings open like a turkey in a butcher's shop. Only her head is turned right way up, and she is seeing more than she has ever seen before in her whole short life. Her world was an aviary no larger than a living room, and then it was a box. But now it is this, and she can see everything. The point source glitter on the waves, a diving cormorant 100 yards out, pigment flakes under wax on the lines of parked cars, far hills and the heather on them, and miles of sky where the sun spreads on dust and water, and illegible things moving in it that are white scraps of gulls. Everything startling and new stamped on her entirely astonished brain.
Helen, you're right. She's a conjuring trick, a reptile, a fallen angel, a griffin from the pages of an illuminated bestiary. And what struck me on rereading your book is the language is just so potent, the choice of words, and it's not surprising. One of your earlier books is Shayla's Fish, a book of poetry. So
yeah, I started off as a poet.
Yes, that's your background, your origins. You're still a poet in writing this book, I think.
Oh, bless you, thank you. I still write a bit of poetry on the side. Don't tell anyone. So with that section, this ridiculous list of all the things she was like in that moment, I was trying really hard to. That section, you start off inside my head and inside my eyes, and there's this sense that no matter how I try to describe this astonishing creature, there are no words, there's nothing that can describe what that moment was like. I fail and fail and fail and fail. And in that failure, I slowly become the point of view of that section. You end up inside the hawk's head, looking at this world with complete bafflement, which is basically what I was doing at the time. I was broken by grief. I didn't know what was going on. Everything was new to me and raw. So I think that section I like to read because it really is a little kind of microcosm of what happens in the book, where through this sort of weird process I end up looking through the hawk's eyes. But the big secret, I told you on the phone about this, the big secret of the book is that, well, when I'm writing, I don't know about you, I can't read anything. I can't read any other books because I'm a real magpie. I end up copying other styles. And so I don't really read at all. Again, it's quite, I'm a writer, not a reader. So I basically was just listening to Agatha Christie radio adaptations and Shakespeare adaptations. And I'm quite convinced now that a lot of the more flowery language in the book is just straight out of my Shakespeare listening. And a lot of the kind of narrative drive of the book comes from Agatha Christie. So I want to say thank you to the Bard and to Dame Agatha for helping me write this book.
It's an Agatha Christie Shakespeare mishmash.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to return to Hawk's Eye a little bit later, but I'm going to return for this moment to questions about writing in general again, but actually more honing in on the books. We looked at why write a memoir, but I'm curious now, intentions, when your intentions for writing the book, were they fulfilled, those intentions? Or did they change during the writing? And just in the interest of democracy here, my intention in writing my book was to tell a story that I thought had to be told, that untold story needed to get out, like you yourself, I had to tell this story. But the result was a cathartic effect, which was an unintended effect of writing the book. I remember at the launch of my book, and I read an extract and stood off the podium, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, which I hadn't known I'd been bearing all those years. And I felt, I wouldn't say light overcome me, but certainly felt a lightness overcome me, which I've carried ever since. So that was not an intention I went into writing, but it was there, and it happened, as a side effect. So intentions going in, and in retrospect, what happened? Were they fulfilled or changed?
I mean, just to jump in, just quickly, just to say yes. So my intention was to tell the story. It needed to be told, and I was happy with that. But more foundationally, what I wanted to do in this book was to say that the mistake I made with this hawk was what we all do all the time with the natural world. We're told that there is that nature is the one place free of human ideas and concepts, and that's nonsense. It's the one place we put all the important things that we want to feel are natural. So we project into the natural world all the things we want to believe are true, and that's why we think of hawks as these murderous, terrifying, kind of forbidding. I don't think the bells is great, talking about hawks with the bells in the background. But, in reality, Mabel was just a chicken with talons. I mean, she was, just a bird, really. And I was projecting all this stuff into her, and I was finding it there, all the grief and wildness. So there's a lot of stuff in this book that I wanted to kind of get across how much we see the natural world as a mirror of our own selves, and how we don't think about that very much, and how important it is, particularly in this sort of an era of environmental breakdown, where we need to know why we value some animals and some landscapes and some creatures more than we do others. So there was a really important kind of undercurrent of sort of, I guess, theory in this book, and I was very pleased that was part of it, and that I was happy with how that came out. Yeah.
Brilliant. So intentions in retrospect and during?
So for me, one of the intentions was to change the narrative around the Syrian story, and I was angry and sick of the news, the way they portrayed the Syrian story, and that the first word that anyone, like if I say I'm from Syria, the first picture would be in their mind is destruction, war, camps, and that's happening, but I also wanted to paint the other picture, life in Syria that I knew before the war. So my book is not political, and the war is just a small chapter in it. It's mostly life before the war and the aftermath of war. And one of the many messages that I get is that I did change the narrative around Syria for people, and that I brought Syria to life when people read my book. So I love getting those messages from people, which makes me feel that I did what I intended with this book, and that they could relate more to the struggles of being a migrant or a refugee, or all that paper borders, the visas, and those struggles, how they can change your life and have that butterfly effect on your life and decisions you make in your life. So I wanted to focus on that in the book. That's one of the intentions. And from the messages that I get, I feel that I managed to get that done.
Brilliant. And also another thing I discovered in your book, you quote really beautifully Khalil Gibran at one point, and his poem is "Do not love half lovers," and you quote, "Do not live half a life, do not die half death. Half a life was a life you didn't live, a word you have not said, a smile you postponed, a love you had not had, a friendship you did not know." Which is in the book, which is absolutely beautiful. I read the poem then, and there's a line, "Do not silence yourself. Do not silence yourself," which I think is a huge important part of your book and your writing as well. From an early age, you were writing to express something as well.
Yeah, so growing up in Saudi Arabia, so I didn't have many things to do, and I was full of questions, curiosity, energy, which I knew later in life that I have ADHD, but
we've just been bonding over our ADHD.
I didn't know that back then, so I needed to express myself in any way. So the only way that was allowed was writing. Nobody would look at that for like a girl who was scribbling something on a notebook, but anything else like, I don't know, running around or dancing, or like I couldn't do any of that. So writing was my only way of expression, and I definitely, like when I wrote the book, that helped with that, not silencing that story that had to be told.
And Helen, another presence in your book we haven't mentioned so far is T.H. White, because the book is about reading as well.
Yeah.
The book is about reading, and you very explicitly say it's not a biography of T.H. White, but he's a presence in the book. And after reading, getting to the end, I realised very obviously the book, T.H. White's book, the Goshawk, the Hawk, I think it's called, the Goshawk, connects you to your childhood, because it's a childhood book. So you're packing it away to move on stage in H4, your movie house, and you pack that book away. But it's also, you remember, as a child, finding a bookshop and bringing it home and being very excited and discovering. So it's a book about reading, and his presence, T.H. White.
Yes, T.H. White was a really interesting presence. He was always going to be in the book, but it wasn't until I went to Texas and read all of his diaries and notebooks are in a sort of centre called the Harry Ransom Centre in Texas, which I kept calling the Harry Ramsden Centre, which is a British fish and chip shop. It went down really badly, and it was very weird to read his diaries about salmon fishing in Donegal, or going fox hunting or whatever in muddy kind of, and it's 90 degrees outside and there were vultures. It was a very weird experience. And he really haunted me writing this book. Because he tried to train a goshawk too in the 1930s. And he was really struggling. He was a very, very unhappy man for a numerous number of reasons. And he, like me, made the mistake of seeing the hawk as kind of the thing he wanted to be. But for T.H. White, what he wanted to be was kind of, he was gay and it was 1930s and lots of things he couldn't be, he saw in the hawk. And he basically fought himself by training this hawk, and the hawk suffered terribly. And I read that book when I was a kid, and I was baffled by A, he didn't seem to know how to train a hawk, he didn't. But B, it was a really cruel book. It was very, very weird and cruel and really upset me. So I wrote this book partly to kind of try and get across that his problem was he was never given any of the tools to love anything, including himself. And that was a great tragedy. But also to kind of solve the puzzle that I had as a child. Why was this man writing a book about something he didn't know how to do? Why would anyone write a book about something they don't know how to do? And of course, Ages of a Hawk is a book about something I didn't know how to do, which is my father's death, And I think writing about things that you don't know how to do is a deep, deep satisfaction, rather than writing nature books which are all about how clever you are and how much you know about the natural world. That writing and that confession of not knowing how things work, I think, it's a kind of gift to yourself and the reader. Try to puzzle it out. Sorry, I'm motoring on a bit.
No, despite your disclaimer, your life story of T.H. White is beautifully done. I really got a sense of his life. I really enjoyed reading that.
I'm very fond of it. He was a monstrous man, but I'm very fond of him.
And in your description of the unboxing the hawk, you talk about, you mentioned there that you saw through the hawk's eyes, which is another interesting connection because as I read more, you look through the hawk's eyes as you train the hawk, you become more attentive to the natural world, more attentive to what's around you, and the earth, to all the worlds. You become attentive. And that connects, I think, another childhood connection, which is your father was a professional photographer. Because he's looking to the camera, attentive. Yeah. So that attention then bring you back constantly to your father. So he's another huge presence in the book as well.
He is a huge presence, and I made a decision really early on. It's a little bit like you were saying about how much do you write about other family members? And I made the decision really early on not to really talk about my mother and my brother very much because they were still alive and had their own stories. But I didn't want the book to be a biography of my father because he was a photographer and his legacy are his photographs. Those are the things he wanted to stand for him after he was gone. But the sense in which he looked at the world as a photographer was very, very much a part of the book. And part of that was, that again, I think was very much like me, short attention span. He loved being a photographer because every morning he had to go out and get the picture. That was it. It was a short-term goal, and there was the perfect picture, and he could get as near to it as possible. That was a result. And he was always full of wonder at the world and had a kind of childlike joy in seeing things that would only happen once and never again. So, frost on cherry blossom or, meteor showers or particular kind of ice crystals around the moon, those kind of things were really important to him and they became very important to me. And he really taught me that, I think it's very trite to say it out loud, but, we're not here very long and our job is to see what's there and to wonder and enjoy it. What else is there? To commemorate the beauties of the world that we're in while we're in it. And that attention, that looking, I think, was very much part of my father's life, and also hopefully in the book as well.
Well, I'm a novice photographer, so I found it all very interesting, and I really love the narrative about your father. It's very beautifully conveyed life, in another life within the story. Yeah,
it's a good lad.
So your book as well, it's a tender love story, which we haven't mentioned so far, and it's the love story between yourself and your now husband Sam, and it's conveyed through these absolutely beautiful Arabic phrases translated into English. She is my love, my life. She is in my eyes. These beautiful phrases. That must be very nice to write about. A nice sort of part of the story to write about the love story and how that resolved itself. Because it wasn't always clear it was going to work out reading the book at all. And so the huge challenges to overcome, the opposition to that, the difficulties.
Yeah, so you're asking like how was writing about that love story?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do with this love story to show how the word refugee was back in Syria. So my husband was from a refugee background. He was Palestinian. Although he never have been to Palestine, his grandfather came from Palestine to Syria in 1948, and he just stayed there. He couldn't go back home, and he had a family. And then my husband was born, and his mother was Syrian, and like his father was born in Syria, but he was never considered Syrian by the Syrian society, and that relationship caused a lot of issues in my family because Syrians never thought one day, it's ironic now when I look back at it, that Syrians never thought they would be refugees, they would be the largest populations of refugees. So I wanted to mention that story because we had to fight for this relationship, but also that how far Syrians were from the word refugee, that a Syrian father, like my father, would not allow this marriage from someone who has a refugee background. And how, like in our own society, we had our own racism issues and refugees issues. So that was part of it, and also the rebellion part where we had to fight for this relationship. And also, I wanted to talk about the mental toll on couples who leave home together and how they change during the war. So my husband, after we leave Syria, a month after that, he loses his father. He gets the news that his father was shot in Syria, and he changes completely after that. And we keep carrying those traumas with us. My relationship with my father, his relationship with his deceased father, his family that joins us later in Egypt, and all we keep going on. But how this relationship of ours, how it's changed through time, and how it affects our love. Like we stayed 6 years almost fighting for that love, but once we got married, then the war happened and it changed us. So how do we keep that love relationship through war and through the trauma? So that's also another aspect, the psychological aftermath of war that I wanted to mention in that love story.
Yeah, it's a way of coming home again to be
Yes.
with one's beloved. Yeah, absolutely. And that title you chose, I Don't Want to Talk About Home, there's a moment in the book when that is used to great effect, the title. And I have to say I was moved to tears when I came to that point in the book, so it's beautifully done.
Thank you.
We're going to move into Q&A from the audience very shortly, so gather your questions. And I came across a quote, Helen, in your book, "The cure for loneliness is solitude," which really Marianne Moore.
Oh, that was Marianne Moore, yeah. It was T.H. White all the way. He said a very sad thing once. He said, he said, falling in love is a devastating experience, but not when it's with a landscape. Which is a really sad sentence. That's the one thing he just feels, he's just expecting rejection, and he never expected to be loved, ever. He had a dreadful family background. But he felt safe loving landscapes and countryside because he knew that they would not reject him. And it's a haunting phrase.
Yeah,
it's haunting.
When I was going through my problems, I craved solitude because never, as in public places like hospitals and so on, waiting rooms and all this, I craved solitude, and I never felt lonely after that because I was on the road to recovery. We're going to ask one more question, which is a very simple one.
This is going to be the tough one, isn't it? This is the tough question.
Two questions, actually. First of all, has the way you think or feel or reflect about your book changed in the time since publication? Because there's often a gap between who we are now and the book, so it's closer to your book's more recent. So I'll ask you first.
Yeah, sure. So since the book, I got my Irish citizenship, and like a huge part of the book was the struggles with the visas and meeting family and traveling. So after the book, I got that, and that was very liberating as well, and life-changing. We could visit, and I could see my family in Saudi Arabia. They could see my child. We traveled a lot, so that really kind of changed the way our life was intense and shaped around those visas and the borders that we couldn't pass. So we felt kind of, before, like when I was writing, we felt kind of stuck in Ireland, but now I feel great when I travel and come back to Ireland. It feels that sense of home, especially at the airport when the passport officer says, "Welcome home," and it is lovely to have that feeling. So I keep telling people whenever they text me about the book, because it's a bit of a sad ending to all the things that happened, but life has changed since that book, and it's changed for the better. I'm grateful for that.
That's really nice. Ages Book, yeah. Well, I mean, initially writing it was very weird. I remember finishing it and then I didn't send it to my publisher for a week. I was so scared. I was like, this is a really weird book. No one's going to read it. And then it became really successful, and that was a great surprise. And but I haven't. It's funny, you know, I've seen those videos of potters making pots. Obviously, you might have even seen real potters making pots, and you can see someone who's spent their whole life learning a skill to take this raw material and make something beautiful, and then they get the wire, and then they lift it off of the wheel and put it down, and then it's not theirs anymore. It's a real thing of its own, and that's how this book always felt to me. I felt that once it was done, it became its own thing, and I could hand it off to others, and other people. Every time someone picks it up and reads it, it belongs to them now. So I've always felt like that about the book, that it's just something I made and doesn't belong to me anymore. And it's funny. I've taken a lot of joy watching it, you know, sort of fly through the world and do its thing. And I've had some very emotional responses from readers who have suffered losses and darknesses of a magnitude much greater than mine, and have felt empowered to speak about it because the book is very honest about things like that. That's changed me. I mean, the readers have changed me, not the book. So the readers have made me a lot softer, and I love people a lot more than I used to. And I'm much, much more of a soft person since this book came out. Yeah. So thank you, readers.
I want to add to that, like for me, I thought I'd put this book out and then go back to my life and the tech world that I belonged to before.
No.
But then I felt like, no, I don't like the tech world. I like the books world. I like literature. I like talking to people, doing events. So that definitely changed my view. It's not a one-time thing that I want to do and move on. I felt like I belong here more. So that's also one of the things that changed after writing the books. Like I quit the tech world and I want to do more books. So that's there.
It's really cool.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left. We will take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to be very mean now and say just questions, not comments or observations. Questions with things with a question mark at the end. So this lady here at the front, yeah.
I had a woman once stand up and read a long poem about a spider that she wrote. That was a low point. So can we not do that?
We do have a roving mic. Jack is a roving mic.
I'm not going to read anything about a spider, don't worry. You guys touched briefly on the idea of forgiveness and privacy for people that maybe appear in your story even tangentially. How much did it influence you as you were writing? How much were you thinking about your readers? Particularly maybe, given that it's a memoir, readers that would know you and know your story, and did that limit you in any way? Did you hold back and scratch that from the page?
Not knowingly. I think there was some censorship, but I don't think it was knowing censorship. It was the kind of censorship that I feel in everyday life. Don't talk about this thing with those people. You know, that's not on. And in my case, it really was just not really talking about my mother and my brother, I think. Everything else I think I was pretty open about. But, you know, and often I've been accused afterwards of like, oh my God, you left your mother and brother and you never spoke to them and you just went off with this hawk. And I'm like, well, it was more complicated than that. I did actually speak to them a lot, but I didn't really feel that that was my place to recount those conversations and those encounters. So if there's any fiction in the book, that was the fiction, simply leaving out live people. And it was quite easy to do that in my case, and I imagine harder for you because there are a lot of people who are still around that you're writing about.
Yeah, I guess going on iterations when you write helps. So first step, everything was on the paper. I wrote everything, and then the second round would be trying to edit that and look at it, when it's on the paper, you feel like this is a strong word, or maybe this is a strong description of this person or the situation. So I try to tone that down a bit. Some parts where I avoided talking about my brothers, for example, my editor said, like, we need to know your brother's reaction to the story, for example. So she kind of asked me to add things where I didn't want to speak about that situation. So I tried to mention it briefly, just their reaction or position from this story. But I tried avoiding going into details into their own life. I knew that from the beginning. It was just my parents, that was the trickiest part for me, and my best friend. But obviously, like, I changed names also as well. That helps with the privacy, and changed few details. So, like, my friends, for example, wouldn't be recognized. But yeah, it wasn't limiting, I would say. I made sure to find that balance between saying the truth and keeping the privacy.
Yeah. It's a major challenge for members, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, the lady there, Dirk is.
Sorry.
Suspense.
My question is for Suad. I just wondered, obviously you write in English, I presume Arabic is your first language. And I just wondered, particularly when you're writing about your life in Syria before the war, does your mind think in Arabic, about that time? And, I'm just wondering, you said, does that make it easier perhaps that you're using English, would say, rather than your original than Arabic? Is that easier to distance yourself from that time, maybe? And also then sometimes does English maybe not fully reflect, your sense of home and that life that Arabic may? Just wonder just how that feels for you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think it's a mix of both. So I believe reading becomes your ink to what you write. And I was reading a lot of memoirs in English. So that kind of gave me the vocabulary to think and write in English. But then at certain points there would be words in Arabic that I would stop and think, like, how is the best way to describe this feeling or this word in English? So I would Google a translation for that word, or like how to describe it, and try to go deeper in it. But I would say, like, I would be able to play with words better in Arabic than English, but I haven't read or written anything in Arabic for a really long time that I find it harder now to write in Arabic. So it's coming now naturally for me to write in English. So it was kind of automatic when I wrote it in English. Yeah. Thanks.
Anybody else? Dirk to the very back there. Near you. Yeah, that's all right.
You mentioned making choices about how you tell your story and doing it with honesty. But I just wondered if either of you have found there are places that you can't go that are too dark or too painful to actually write about and avoid them, or did you go there?
I went there. I went really hard on how dark everything was. And that was strangely easy to write for me, because it was so dark and so painful that the words it was like they kind of stumbled out. But that was just a personal grief and a personal pain and a really deep depression, and no one else was involved apart from me. So it was quite easy to just confess all that and how broken I was. I think it would be more difficult if other people had been part of that pain.
Yeah, I went there too. That's the whole purpose, I think, from writing a memoir. You want to go to those dark places and you want to unleash all the monsters and just set them free. And yeah, it was hard, and I avoided them. Like, I postponed writing about those dark moments. But at some point, yeah, I would just sit there and use all the memory triggers, whether it's emails, texts, music, photos from back home, and just absorb it all, cry it all out, and just write my heart on the paper. that's what I did.
And it seems to use the tool of postponement as a way to write those sections. Because I know when I was writing some of the more darker episodes in my book, I couldn't do it at my usual writing place, which is, as in house shares in the bedroom, my own bedroom. I couldn't write those passages on depression in the bedroom because the energy was embodying me, I was embodying it. So I went to a little cafe which is full of...
Yeah, I wrote all mine in cafes.
Yeah,
I couldn't write it at home.
Life and
Yeah,
light
lots of
and-
people around and...
Is that possible then? Yeah.
Actually, the difficult bits, that's not true, the difficult bits for me, there was a couple of moments where I had to describe my father lying in the hospital after he died in a pair of pyjamas under a terrible duvet. And that meeting and that seeing him there, that was very hard to write. Because it was without words, that experience, and very few are. So I rewrote that about 25 million times, but everything else, all the other darknesses were very easy to write about. But that, it was meant to be very simple expository language about what it's like to see your father lying in state, I guess.
But when it really experiences that trauma, that moment of writing, I think, if
Yeah.
one really gets into it.
Oh yeah, you're back there, you're right back
Yeah.
there.
Which might be why it's so liberating to have, and relieving to have completed that task, perhaps. It's just relief.
Yeah. Ooh, we're really going for the big stuff here.
Lady there, yeah.
You touched, you touched a little bit into it there, but about your writing process. So one thing was like writing in cafes or what have you. So I'm curious about the writing process generally, and as a fellow ADHD woman, like just around keeping the momentum going. So did you tend to do like a little bit often, or did you do like long chunks, or did you intersperse? I imagine it might be different depending on how, like kind of what Arnold was saying there, around maybe some of those deeper bits really needed a time kind of segued off in other parts. So just curious about the writing process, where, how often, length of time. Thank you.
So for me, when I wrote it, it was during the pandemic. So fortunately, there was no cafes. Well, at least the most of it, the biggest part of it. And I don't like to write at home or know how to write at home. I just can't focus. But somehow I managed to find a way, like just to stay at night. After I put my kid to sleep, I would just stay, I think, from 8 till midnight for like 4 or 5 hours and focused into it. And like speaking about ADHD, because when you're focused on, so hyper-focusing on something, so I think that what made the words flow regardless of the place, regardless of what's happening. But then towards the end of it, I would go to cafes and write more. I focus way much better in cafes than at home. I think I just disconnect and my mind feels the pressure that you have to write now for the long of an hour or an hour and a half. So that's kind of how it worked for me. I wrote big chunks whenever I felt like it. I feel like I just followed my words, the flow of words, and then connecting the pieces all together. That was the annoying part, I would say. But yeah, that's more or less how it goes for me. How about you?
Yeah, coffee was how I wrote. I'm a morning person, so I'd get up, have a cup of coffee, write something, go to a cafe and write. And there's actually a really fun story about this. I wrote most of it in the Costa Coffee in Newmarket, my local town, home of British horse racing, not the most intellectual of British towns. I adore it. And when the book won the Costa Book of the Year, the Costa people were very excited about it. And they arranged that an enormous amount of delightful cakes would appear at the local Costa Coffee bar, and that anyone who had a copy of the book could bring it in and get free cakes. And I said, mate, no one's read the book in Newmarket. Everyone reads the Racing Post, like, what? It's a horse racing town. And I went in the day after and there were like all these free cakes because no one had come in. I was proud of my town. But basically, yeah, so my writing style is really odd in that I think it comes from writing poetry, which is how I started, in that I would write and then every day I would have to read everything that I'd written to the point where I stopped in order to keep going, to feel the shape of the book, which meant that towards the end, I didn't start writing until like 8 p.m. But there was a lovely point, I don't know whether you felt this with your book, I've never written anything so long before, and there was this point, you struggle and struggle and you sort of build the book, and I don't know whether you felt it. But there comes a point for me, came a point, about 3/4 of the way through, where I began to feel the book pushing and resisting me. I wanted it to go a certain way, It didn't want to do that. It was like wrangling a horse or something. It was like equestrian metaphors today. But yeah, so there was a lovely sense that the book knew where it wanted to go. And that was a lovely moment because I just ended up trusting the book then and letting it take me where it needed to go. But until then, it was hard work, yeah. It was a lot of reading and swearing and crying and drinking a lot of coffee.
We're going to wrap up here. I will ask one final question and we'll wrap up because we've gone over time. So people are going to other events. But the question, whither next? What next, Suad, for your writing? Are you working on anything new? What should we expect from you? That's the expression, or just even in process. How you get on?
I definitely want to write more. As I said before, like I thought I'll just write this book and move on, but the literature world kept pulling back, and I felt I belonged there more. So I want to write something else. I'm still between fiction and non-fiction.
Yeah.
I want to explore the fiction world as well. I have several ideas. We'll see which one will go through.
Helen, you're in the midst of a book tour, so maybe you're not thinking what's next.
Yeah, no, I'm in a book tour because I decided that the most logical thing to do after a giant memoir nature writing thing would be to write a giant sci-fi novel with a dear friend. So 3:30, is it 7? 3:30 today, I will be talking with Sid and Porrick about this book, Prophet, which has got so much swearing in it. It's not nature writing, but it's got many, many more jokes than my grief memoir, so that's what I did next.
Okay, so that is the end of the panel. Thank you, Suad, and thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Aaron.